They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but for a woman like Maggie Vance, beauty felt like a locked gate. A gate she was simply too wide to pass through. Back east, they told her she took up too much space. They told her that her size made her unworthy of love. She traveled 2,000 miles hoping the frontier would be different. She hoped the West would be big enough to hold a heart like hers. She was wrong, at least at first. She didn't know that her salvation wasn't waiting in a town full of shallow men. It was waiting high up on the mountain, where only the strong can survive. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of the Old West, of survival, redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. The iron wheels of the locomotive screeched against the tracks. The sound was like a dying scream. It pierced right through Maggie's ears. Steam hissed into the dry, dusty air of Oakhaven. It swirled around the platform, smelling of burning coal and hot metal. Maggie Vance sat frozen in her seat. Her hands were shaking. She gripped her small, worn carpet bag so tight her knuckles turned white. She took a breath, but it was shallow. Her corset felt like a cage of whalebone and steel. It dug into her ribs. It pinched her soft waist. Every breath was a battle. She had laced it tighter than usual this morning. She wanted to look smaller. She wanted to shrink herself down so she wouldn't offend the eyes of a stranger. "Oakhaven! All out for Oakhaven!" the conductor shouted. Maggie swallowed hard. Her throat was dry as sand. She stood up. The movement was difficult in the narrow aisle. She felt her hips bump against the wooden seat. A man behind her sighed loudly, impatient for her to move. Heat flushed up her neck. She kept her head down. She shuffled toward the door, feeling the weight of her own body like a heavy sack of grain. She stepped down onto the wooden platform. The boards groaned under her boots. To Maggie, that sound was a judgment. It was a reminder that she was heavy. She looked around through the clearing smoke. The sun was blinding. The town looked rough, just dirt streets and wooden false fronts. She wasn't the only woman stepping off the train. There were 3 others. They were mail-order brides, just like her. But they were different. They were slender. They were delicate like willow branches. Maggie watched as men approached them. The men smiled. They tipped their hats. They offered arms to these fragile creatures. Maggie stood alone near a stack of crates. She felt exposed. She felt like a boulder sitting in a field of wildflowers. She pulled a crumpled letter from her pocket. It was from Julian Sterling. He spoke of needing a wife to help run his general store. He spoke of companionship, but he had never asked for a photograph. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wiped sweat from her forehead. Then she saw him. A man was walking through the crowd. He was dressed in a fine gray suit. He was handsome, with slicked back hair and a sharp jawline. He was holding a piece of paper that matched the one in her hand. He scanned the platform. His eyes passed over the thin women. He was looking for someone else. His eyes landed on Maggie. He didn't smile. He stopped walking. The look on his face shifted instantly. It went from anticipation to cold, hard shock. He took a slow step toward her, his lip curling up in a way that made Maggie's blood run cold. Julian Sterling didn't rush toward her. He walked slowly, deliberate and cold. He looked like a man inspecting a crate of apples that had arrived bruised and rotten. He stopped 3 feet away from Maggie. He didn't take off his hat. He didn't offer his hand. He just stood there, smelling of expensive cologne and disdain. "Are you Miss Vance?" His voice wasn't warm. It was sharp, like the crack of a dry twig. Maggie nodded. She tried to force a smile, but her lips trembled. She tried to curtsy, a gesture of politeness she had practiced for weeks. "I am Mr. Sterling. It is a pleasure to finally—" He cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. He looked her up and down, openly and without shame. His eyes lingered on her waist, then her hips, then back to her face. It wasn't a look of desire. It was a look of calculation. He was measuring her, and she was coming up short in all the ways he cared about, and too much in all the ways he didn't. "You left out a few details in your letters," he said. He didn't lower his voice. The couple standing near the baggage cart stopped talking. They turned to look. Maggie felt the blood rush to her face. It burned like a fever. "Sir, my general store requires a certain presentation," Julian said, smoothing his own silk vest. He spoke as if she were a piece of furniture that wouldn't fit through the door. "I need a woman who adds elegance to the front of the house. A decoration." He took a step closer, invading her space just to make her feel smaller. "I sent for a wife, Miss Vance, not a burden to feed." The words hit her harder than a closed fist. The air left her lungs. She gripped her carpetbag until her fingers ached. I am a hard worker," Maggie stammered. Her voice was barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of her shame. "I am strong, Mr. Sterling. I can work." "Strength is for mules," Julian sneered. "I wanted a wife." He took the letter he was holding, the one she had written him with such hope, and crumpled it in his fist. He dropped the ball of paper into the dust at her boots. "You can get back on that train," he said, dismissing her. "I certainly won't be paying for the return ticket." He turned on his polished heel and walked away. He didn't look back once. The platform went deadly silent. Maggie stood there, alone in the center of the stage. She could feel the eyes of the town on her. She felt their pity. She felt their amusement. The steam engine let out a long, mournful whistle, signaling its departure. The train was leaving. Her money was gone. She was stranded in a world that had just told her she wasn't worth the space she occupied. From the deep shade of the feed store awning, a pair of dark eyes watched the whole ugly scene. Arthur Halloway, known to the locals simply as Grizz, shifted his weight. The wooden planks of the porch groaned under his massive boots. He was a giant of a man. He stood 6'6". His shoulders were as wide as a barn door. A thick, unruly beard hid most of his face. A jagged white scar ran down his left cheek, disappearing into the whiskers. Most folks gave Grizz a wide berth. They thought he was half animal. They thought the mountains had taken his mind. But Grizz wasn't an animal. He was just a man who knew the difference between iron and tin. And Julian Sterling was tin, shiny, cheap, and hollow. Grizz watched the woman on the platform. She wasn't wailing. She was standing statue still. She was trying to keep her dignity while her world crumbled around her ankles. Grizz looked at her. He didn't see what Sterling saw. He didn't see too much. He saw sturdy hips that could carry a heavy pack without buckling. He saw broad shoulders that could swing an axe. He saw a face that was soft, yes, but he saw eyes that held a quiet kind of steel. He spat into the dust. He stepped off the porch. The crowd parted like water. People scurried out of his way. They whispered as he passed, but he didn't care. Grizz walked with a heavy, thudding rhythm. He walked right up to where Maggie stood staring at her boots. A shadow fell over her. A shadow so big it blocked out the harsh afternoon sun. Maggie flinched. She looked up, and her breath hitched in her throat. The man standing over her was terrifying. He wore buckskins stained with grease and pine pitch. A massive knife hung at his belt. He smelled of wood smoke and old leather. "He's a fool," the giant rumbled. His voice was deep. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. Maggie took a half step back, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield. I have no money, sir. I cannot give you anything." "Didn't ask for money," Grizz grunted. He kept his hands visible, palms open, showing he meant no harm. He hooked a thick thumb toward the distant snow-capped peaks. "I got a cabin up in the Bitterroots. It's hard living. I need help. I need someone strong enough to handle the winter. Someone who can work." He looked her right in the eye. He didn't look at her waist. He didn't look at her chin. He looked at her. "I don't need a china doll for a shelf, miss," he said quietly, his voice rumbling low so only she could hear. "I need a partner. You coming?" Maggie looked back at the station. She looked at the empty tracks where the train had disappeared. Then she looked up at the scarred face of Arthur Halloway. It was a choice between a slow death by starvation in a town that hated her or taking a chance on the wild unknown. At least this Grizz looked her in the eye. "I have nowhere else," she whispered, gripping her bag tighter. "I'll go." Arthur didn't smile. He just nodded once, a sharp dip of his bearded chin. "Keep up then." They didn't take a carriage. There were no horses waiting. Arthur turned his back to the town and started walking toward the tree line. Maggie had to jog a few steps just to catch his stride. They walked past the saloon, past the staring faces of the locals, and straight out into the sagebrush. The ground changed quickly. The soft dust of the street turned into hard-packed dirt and loose shale. The road narrowed until it was nothing more than a deer trail winding up into the foothills. The air grew thinner. The sun beat down on Maggie's back, heavy and hot. Within 20 minutes, Maggie's lungs were burning. Her corset felt like iron bands crushing her ribs. Every step was a labor. Her heavy skirts tangled around her ankles, dragging in the dirt. She could feel the sweat trickling down her back. She was gasping for air, her breath coming in ragged, noisy heaves. She kept her eyes on the ground, terrified to look up. She knew what was coming. She waited for it. She waited for him to stop. She waited for him to turn around and laugh. She waited for him to say she was too slow, too heavy, too useless to make the climb. Just like Julian, she thought. Just like everyone else. But the insult never came. Ahead of her, the crunch of boots stopped. Maggie froze, her chest heaving. She looked up, bracing herself for the anger. Arthur wasn't angry. He was standing by a large boulder, leaning on his rifle. He wasn't tapping his foot impatiently. He was just watching her. His eyes were calm. "Breathe deep," he said. His voice wasn't mocking. It was an instruction. Short breaths don't fill the blood. Breathe deep. In through the nose. He didn't offer to carry her bag. He knew she needed to carry her own weight to survive up here. But he did something else. He shifted his pack. He slowed his pace. When he started walking again, he didn't take the long, loping strides of a mountain man. He matched his rhythm to hers. He didn't leave her behind. He simply adjusted the world to fit her speed. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Maggie's legs felt like jelly. She was drenched in sweat, her fancy city dress clinging to her skin in all the wrong places. But she had made it. She hadn't asked him to stop. She hadn't collapsed. Arthur's homestead wasn't much to look at if you were used to city mansions. It was a squat, solid structure made of logs as thick as a man's waist. Mud chinking filled the gaps. It looked less like a house and more like a fortress built to withstand the wrath of God. It sat right on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a valley of endless pines. Arthur pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung silent on greased hinges. "Inside," he grunted. Maggie stepped over the threshold. The air inside was cool and still. It smelled rich, a mix of curing leather, dried sage, and stale wood smoke. It was a masculine scent, heavy and earthbound. She kept her elbows tucked in tight against her ribs. In Julian Sterling's shop, the aisles had been narrow, filled with fragile glass and porcelain. Maggie had spent her whole life terrified of knocking things over, of her hips bumping a table and shattering something beautiful. She felt that same fear now. She felt huge in this small, dark space. She felt like a bull in a pantry. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized something. There was no china here. There were no delicate vases. The table was a slab of pine that you could butcher a deer on. The chairs were rough-hewn and sturdy. Iron skillets hung from hooks. And there were no mirrors. Maggie looked around, instinctively wanting to smooth her hair to see how red and blotchy her face was after the climb. But there wasn't a single piece of glass on the walls. For the first time that day, she felt a tiny knot in her chest loosen. Here, she didn't have to look at herself. Arthur walked past her, his boots thumping on the floorboards. He pointed a calloused finger toward a door on the far wall. "Yours," he said. Maggie approached it cautiously. She pushed the door open. It was a small room, barely big enough for a bed and a chest. But the bed frame wasn't a flimsy metal thing. It was built from whole logs, stripped of bark, but left round and thick. It looked like it could hold the weight of a bear. "I built it last summer," Arthur said from behind her. He wasn't boasting. He was just stating a fact. "Mattress is stuffed with fresh straw and lavender. It'll hold." Maggie touched the rough wood of the bedpost. It felt solid, unshakable. For a woman who had spent her life being told she was too heavy for the world, a bed that wouldn't creak or groan felt like a luxury greater than silk. The first week up on the mountain wasn't easy. It wasn't a honeymoon. It was a standoff. Two strangers trapped in a box of logs while the wind began to howl outside. The silence between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maggie moved through the cabin like she was walking on eggshells. She was terrified of taking up too much room. She tried to make herself invisible, which was hard for a woman of her size. She woke up before dawn every morning. She scrubbed the pine floors until her knees were raw. She polished the cast-iron stove until it gleamed black. She wanted to prove she was worth the food she ate. She wanted to earn the air she breathed. Every time she bumped into a table corner, she flinched. "Sorry," she would whisper. Every time she dropped a spoon, "I'm so sorry." Every time she crossed Arthur's path to get to the water bucket, "Excuse me, sorry." Arthur just watched her. He sat by the fire in the evenings, whittling a piece of cedar or oiling his traps. He didn't say much, maybe 10 words a day. "Stew's good." Going out. "Wood's low." To Maggie, his silence felt like judgment. She filled the quiet with her own fears. She thought he was regretting his choice. She imagined he was looking at her broad back and wishing he had left her on that platform in Oak Haven. She was waiting for the insults she had heard all her life to start coming out of his mouth. Dinner was the hardest part. On the third night, Maggie ladled out a massive bowl of stew for Arthur. For herself, she took a tiny portion, just a few spoonfuls of broth and a single potato. She sat down, keeping her elbows tight to her sides, trying not to look hungry. Arthur stopped eating. He held his wooden spoon mid-air. He looked at his overflowing bowl, then at her nearly empty one. His brow furrowed. Those thick, bushy eyebrows came together like storm clouds. "You sick?" he grumbled. Maggie shook her head quickly, her face heating up. "No, Mr. Halloway. I don't want to be expensive. I know I'm big. I don't need much." Arthur stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute. The fire popped in the hearth. He didn't offer soft words. He didn't tell her she was pretty. That wasn't his way. Instead, he stood up. He walked over to the iron pot, ladled out a second heap of venison and potatoes, and dropped it into her bowl with a heavy splash. "Can't chop wood on broth," he said flatly. He sat back down and went back to eating, leaving Maggie staring at the steaming food. She was confused. She had never met a man who measured her worth by her work capacity rather than her waistline. It happened on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was bleeding out behind the peaks. The cabin was warm. Maggie was exhausted. She had spent the day hauling water from the creek, her arms aching with a good, honest soreness. She turned to sit at the small table near the window to peel potatoes. She didn't drop her weight carelessly. She sat as she always did, carefully, hesitantly. But the chair was old. It was a spindly thing, likely brought up the mountain by a previous owner who cared more for style than substance. As soon as Maggie settled, there was a sharp, sickening crack. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The back left leg shattered. The wood splintered instantly. Maggie gasped as the world tilted. She tumbled backward, hitting the floor hard. Her skirts flew up in a tangle of fabric. Potatoes rolled across the floorboards like escaping marbles. For a second, there was silence. Then came the pain of the fall, followed immediately by a wave of shame so hot it felt like a scald. Maggie scrambled to her knees, but she didn't stand up. She stayed on the floor, burying her face in her hands. She began to sob. It was an ugly, desperate sound. This was it. This was the moment. She had broken his furniture. She had proven Julian Sterling right. She was a burden. She was a disaster. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice thick with tears. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for it. I'll sleep in the barn. I'm too heavy. I know I am. I'm so clumsy." She waited for the laughter. She waited for the anger. Instead, she heard the heavy thud of boots. Arthur walked over. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, which would have made her feel more pathetic. He knelt down next to the broken chair. He picked up the splintered leg. He turned it over in his massive hands, inspecting the grain. "Look here," he said. His voice was calm. Maggie looked up, wiping her eyes with her apron. She was shaking. Arthur held the wood out. The center of it was dark and powdery. "Dry rot," he grunted. "Bugs got into the heart of it years ago. Weak wood." He stood up and tossed the broken leg into the fire. It caught flame instantly. He looked down at Maggie. He didn't look disgusted. He looked serious. "Wasn't you, Maggie. It was the chair. It was a liar. It looked strong, but it was rotten inside." He walked to the corner of the room and dragged over a bench. It was something he had built himself. It was made of solid oak, reinforced with iron bands. It was heavy, ugly, and indestructible. He placed it in front of her. "Sit," he commanded gently. "I build things to last, Maggie, and so was you. No more apologizing for being real." Winter in the Bitterroots didn't ask for permission. It kicked the door down. By mid-November, the world turned white. The snow didn't drift. It piled up in walls of ice that blocked the windows. The wind screamed through the valley like a wounded animal. It was a cold so deep it made your bones ache just by standing near a window. Life became a war. It wasn't about comfort anymore, it was about heat. Arthur couldn't do it all alone. He needed to check the trap lines before the passes froze over completely. That left the homestead chores to Maggie. And these weren't city chores. There was no coal man coming to deliver fuel. If they wanted fire, they had to make it. Maggie stepped out into the biting air. She wore a coat made of thick wool that Arthur had traded for. She pulled her scarf up over her nose. She picked up the splitting axe. It was heavy. The handle was smooth from years of Arthur's grip. At first, she was clumsy. The axe head bounced off the frozen pine. The shock vibrated up her arms and rattled her teeth, but she kept at it. She planted her feet wide in the snow. She used her hips. She used the weight of her body, that same weight she used to hate, to drive the steel down. Thwack. The log split clean in two. Thwack. Another one. Sweat gathered on her brow despite the freezing temperature. Maggie realized something as she worked. She wasn't cold. The thin, waif-like girls back in Oak Haven. They would be turning blue right now. They would be shivering in their corsets. But Maggie, she was a furnace. Her body had reserves. Her strength was real. She hauled the wood into the cabin, armload after armload. Her muscles burned, but it was a good burn. It felt like power. Arthur returned just as the sun was setting. He was covered in frost, his beard frozen into icicles. He saw the stack of wood by the stove. It was piled high, enough to last 3 days. He looked at the axe leaning by the door. Then he looked at Maggie. She was red-faced, tired, but standing tall. He didn't say good job. That wasn't his way. He just unbuckled his snowshoes and nodded. "Good stack," he rumbled. "You swing true." For the first time in her life, Maggie didn't feel big. She felt capable. The mountain didn't fight fair. Just as Maggie was finding her rhythm, the sky turned a bruised, angry gray. The blizzard that hit wasn't just snow. It was a white wall of violence. It buried the cabin up to the roofline in a single night. The wind howled down the chimney, sending puffs of ash into the room. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the heat rising inside Arthur. It started with a cough, a dry hacking sound that rattled in his deep chest. Then came the shivers. Arthur Halloway, the man who could wrestle a mule and win, was suddenly shaking so hard his teeth clicked together. An old wound on his leg, a jagged memory of a bear trap, had turned angry and red. Infection had set in, quick and vicious. By the second night of the storm, the giant had fallen. Arthur lay on the bed, delirious. He was thrashing, muttering names of people long dead. His skin was burning to the touch, but he was freezing. "Cold," he groaned, his voice a broken whisper. "So cold." Maggie was terrified. She piled every fur and blanket they owned on top of him. She heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, tucking them against his feet. But the shivers wouldn't stop. His massive frame convulsed, shaking the sturdy log bed. He was dying. The cold was in his bones, and the fever was eating his mind. Maggie looked at him. He looked small for the first time. She looked at her own hands. She looked at her body, the body Julian Sterling had called a burden, the body she had spent years trying to starve away. She made a choice. She stripped off her heavy wool dress. She climbed into the narrow bed. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the heavy bear furs over both of them and pressed her body against his. She wrapped her arms around his shivering shoulders. She pressed her soft, warm front against his rigid, freezing back. She became a human blanket. Her weight, her warmth, her very substance was the only thing standing between Arthur and the dark. Arthur flinched at the contact, then let out a long, ragged sigh. He instinctively turned toward the heat. He buried his face in her shoulder. Maggie held him tight. She realized then, in the dark of the storm, that being too much was exactly what was needed. A thin woman couldn't generate this heat. A fragile woman couldn't anchor him like this. She wasn't a burden. She was life. The storm broke 2 days later. The wind died down, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy. Arthur's fever had broken with the weather, but the sickness had taken its toll. The man was a husk. He lay on the bed, pale and shaking, too weak to lift a spoon, let alone a rifle. But the mountain doesn't respect weakness. It smells it. It started at dusk, a low guttural growling coming from the back of the cabin, then the frantic screaming of the mules in the lean-to, the heavy thud of bodies hitting wood. Wolves. They were hungry, and they knew the master of the house was down. Arthur tried to sit up, his face twisted in pain. He clawed at the blankets, trying to reach for his weapon leaning against the wall. "Maggie," he rasped, his voice a broken wheeze. "The mules, they'll tear him apart." He tried to swing his legs out of bed, but his knees buckled. He collapsed back onto the mattress, groaning in frustration. He was helpless, a warrior stripped of his strength. Maggie didn't scream. She didn't hide. A cold calm washed over her. She looked at Arthur, then she looked at the heavy double-barreled shotgun by the door. It was a massive weapon, an old 10-gauge that kicked like a mule. Arthur had warned her about it. He said it would knock a grown man onto his back if he didn't have the weight to stand behind it. Maggie walked over and picked it up. It was heavy, cold steel and oiled walnut. It felt serious in her hands. "Stay down, Arthur," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. She threw the heavy latch on the back door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and blood. Inside the lean-to, shadows moved. A massive gray wolf had a mule cornered, its teeth bared, ready to hamstring the terrified animal. The wolf turned its golden eyes toward Maggie. It snarled, mist pluming from its jaws. It didn't fear her. It saw a woman. It saw prey. It lunged. Maggie didn't flinch. She planted her boots wide on the floorboards. She leaned into the stock of the gun, using her shoulder, her weight, her solid frame to brace for the blow. She didn't close her eyes. Boom! The sound was deafening in the small space. A flash of fire lit up the snow. The recoil slammed into Maggie's shoulder, a brutal kick that would have shattered the collarbone of a waif. But Maggie absorbed it. She rocked back, but she didn't fall. The wolf dropped midair, a heap of fur and silence. Smoke drifted from the barrels. Maggie stood there in the doorway, the gun still raised. The ringing in her ears was loud, but her heart was steady. She wasn't the rejected girl on the train platform anymore. She was the matriarch of the mountain, and she protected what was hers. Maggie barred the door with trembling hands. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her knees weak. She leaned the shotgun back in its corner. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled the small cabin, mixing with the scent of pine. She turned to look at the bed. Arthur was awake. He was propped up on his elbows, sweat beading on his pale forehead. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at her. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and something softer, something like awe. "You didn't run," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. Maggie walked to the bedside. She took a cloth and wiped his brow. "Running doesn't save the mules, Arthur, and it doesn't save you." Over the next week, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. As Arthur's strength returned, the silence between them changed. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was the comfortable silence of partners. Arthur watched her constantly. He watched her lift the heavy iron pots. He watched her haul the wood. He didn't see a woman who needed to be managed. He saw a woman who held up the roof. One evening, Arthur was finally strong enough to sit by the fire. He motioned for Maggie to sit beside him on the bench, the sturdy oak bench he had built for her. He reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused and scarred, swallowing her soft hand completely. He ran his thumb over her knuckles. "You told me once that man in town rejected you," Arthur said, his voice low and gravelly. "Said you were too heavy." Maggie looked down, the old shame trying to creep back in. He wanted something delicate, something pretty to look at. Arthur made a sound in his throat, a scoff. He reached up and touched her chin, forcing her to look at him. He turned his face so the firelight hit his jagged scar, the mark that made children in town run away. "Look at me, Maggie. I ain't pretty. I'm scarred. I'm rough. I'm hard to look at." "No," Maggie said instinctively, her fingers brushing the white line on his cheek. "You look strong." "Exactly," Arthur rumbled. He leaned in closer. "And so do you. That man Sterling, he wanted a flower. But flowers die in the frost, Maggie. Up here, a flower snaps in the wind. I didn't need a flower. I needed a mountain. A mountain needs a mountain to stand beside it." Maggie's breath hitched. For the first time, she saw herself through his eyes. She wasn't too much. She was enough. She was substantial. Arthur didn't wait. He leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle peck-on-the-cheek kiss. It was deep. It was hungry. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found the one thing in the world solid enough to hold his heart. The thaw brought the green back to the Bitterroots. The creek swelled with snowmelt, roaring down mountainside like wild horses. It was time for the spring trade. Arthur needed supplies, and Maggie needed to face the ghosts she had left behind. They rode into Oakhaven side by side on mule wagon. But this wasn't same woman who had stepped off train months ago, shrinking inside her clothes. Maggie sat high on bench. She wore a coat of silver fox fur that Arthur had tanned for her. Her cheeks were flushed with health, not shame. Her corset was gone, replaced by a sturdy leather belt that cinched a dress made for work, not for show. The town went quiet as they rolled down Main Street. People stopped sweeping their porches. They stared. They remembered the rejected bride, the woman left crying on the platform. But they didn't recognize this queen of the wild sitting next to terrifying mountain man. Arthur pulled wagon to a halt, right in front of Sterling's general store. He hopped down, his movements fluid and easy now that his leg had healed. He reached up, grabbed Maggie by the waist, his hands spanning her hips easily, and swung her down to the dirt. He didn't let go immediately. He held her close, a silent claim for everyone to see. The bell above door jingled. Julian Sterling stepped out onto porch, wiping his hands on a pristine white apron. He froze when he saw them. He looked at Arthur, the scar and the size of him causing Julian to swallow hard. Then he looked at Maggie. His eyes widened. He didn't see a pathetic, rejected girl. He saw a woman who glowed with vitality. He saw the expensive furs draped over her shoulders. "But old habits die hard," Julian sneered, trying to regain his composure. Well, if it isn't the surplus cargo, I see you survived the winter. I expected the cold would have been difficult for someone of your appetite." Arthur growled. It was a low animal sound. He took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the knife at his belt. But Maggie put a hand on Arthur's chest. She didn't push him back. She just held him. She stepped forward, towering over the shorter shopkeep in her boots. "The winter was hard, Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was steady, projecting clear across the street. "But it burns away the rot. It reveals what is strong and what is hollow." She looked him up and down, mimicking the way he had inspected her months ago. She looked at his soft hands, his narrow chest, his nervous eyes. "You were right to send me away," she said, a small, pitying smile playing on her lips. "I was too much of a woman for a man like you to handle. You would have broken under the weight of a real life. I needed a mountain, and all you had to offer was a molehill." She turned her back on him. "Come, Arthur, let's find a store that sells quality goods." Julian Sterling stood there, mouth open, as the town whispered and chuckled around him. He had thrown away a diamond because he wanted a rhinestone, and now he knew it. The wagon wheels crunched rhythmically over the loose shale as they climbed higher, leaving the petty noise of Oakhaven far below. The air grew thinner and sweeter, smelling of pine resin and melting snow. The sun was beginning its slow descent, turning the sky into a canvas of burnt orange and violet. About halfway up the trail, Arthur pulled on the reins. Whoa! The mules sputtered and slowed to a halt beside a high-altitude lake. The water was glass still, a perfect mirror reflecting the jagged peaks and the endless sky. It was a place of absolute truth. "Water's clear," Arthur grunted. "Good for the mules." He hopped down to tend to the animals, but Maggie didn't move immediately. She sat on the bench, looking down into the water near the bank. For years she had avoided mirrors. In the city, mirrors were enemies. They showed her a woman who didn't fit into the narrow dresses or the narrow minds of society. They showed her too fat, too wide, too much. But as she peered into the crystal-clear mountain water, she didn't see that woman anymore. The reflection showed a woman wrapped in silver fox fur. It showed a face bronzed by the wind and sun, glowing with health. It showed shoulders that had carried logs and fired a 10-gauge shotgun. It showed a body that had kept a dying man alive through the warmth of a blizzard. She didn't see a burden, she saw a survivor. Arthur walked up beside the wagon. He saw her staring at the water. He didn't say a word. He just reached up and placed his large, warm hand over hers. He squeezed it gently. "What do you see, Maggie?" he asked softly. Maggie looked from the water to the man standing beside her, the man who had seen her worth when no one else could. She squeezed his hand back, her grip strong and sure. "I see a wife," she whispered, a smile breaking across her face like the sunrise. "I see a partner, and I see a mountain." Arthur chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth. He climbed back onto the wagon seat next to her. The bench didn't creak. It held them both, solid and true. "Let's go home, Maggie," he said. "Yes," she replied, leaning her head against his massive shoulder as the wagon lurched forward. "Let's go home." They disappeared into the tree line, two giants in a world built for them, leaving the smallness of the valley far behind. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. There is an old saying out here, "Don't judge the timber by the bark." Maggie and Arthur proved that true strength isn't about looking perfect. It's about standing tall when the storm hits. If this story touched your heart, please do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more folks. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a tale from the frontier. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been judged by someone who couldn't see your true worth? How did you prove them wrong? If you're hungry for more stories of survival and redemption, check out the playlist on your screen right now. Until next time, keep your fire burning and stay safe on the trail.